welcome you to the September SERI webinar, Approaches to Electronic Records Transfers. So this is the September, but I wanted to give you guys a heads up that there will be a webinar on Electronic Records Day about machine learning and AI, which I'm sure most of us are very interested in, and that will be on October 10th. And then on November 14th, we're going to have a new kind of webinar time. It will be called Chatting with SERI, which will allow people to come and discuss with each other around a certain topic. So we're starting this with web harvesting, and that will be November 14th. And speaking of upcoming events, Becky, if you could put up a poll. We are wanting to get some feedback from our attendees to these webinars about some potential topics for upcoming events. So if you could rank your interest, so 1 being least interested, 5 being most interested, kind of rank these. So there's that question, which is a ranking question. And then there is a second question, which is an open-ended question, which has, if you can give a different topic you can think of, or if you're willing to speak on it a bit, and give your information, or you know a speaker that could talk about those topics. So if you can answer both of those questions, we would really appreciate getting information from you about what you're interested in so that we can shape our events coming in the spring. Give you a few seconds for that. Oh, I'm seeing in the chat that the poll went away. Becky, is there a timing on that, or is it just really quick?
It should still be out. Does anybody else not see it anymore? I wonder if you...
It also just went away from me too.
Yeah,
okay.
It was up for a few seconds for me. Is there a way to start it again?
I will relaunch it.
Okay, thank you, Becky.
Okay, does everybody see it again?
I'm seeing it. So okay. Yes, you have the ranking question, and then scroll down and you'll see the open-ended question, the 2 questions, and then hit submit. So we'll give it a few minutes. Oh, and I'm seeing that you also have to scroll over to see 1 through 5 fully, because it came up for me. The 4 was not showing. So ranking 1 to 5, 1 being least interested, 5 being most interested. Is everyone good on that, on the poll? Okay, I'm not seeing anyone saying I need more time, so I think we'll move on. Thank you, Becky, and thanks for everyone for giving your feedback. Also wanted to point out the online resources in the Resource Center, and if you miss a webinar, if you want to look back at some topics we've done before, all of our webinar recordings are on YouTube, so you can check our YouTube channel for those as well. I also want to thank our sponsor, Preservica, who helps support these education programs. And today, I've already introduced myself, and then I also want to introduce our speaker, Krista. As of December 2020, Krista Sorensen serves as the Electronic Records and Digital Preservation Archivist for the Wisconsin Historical Society. As such, she helps facilitate the transfer of electronic records from state and local units of government, as well as manuscript donors. Additionally, she manages the processing for, preservation of, and access to the Society's Born Digital collections. Prior to her start at WHS, Krista worked on digitization projects at the State Library of North Carolina and in local government records management at the Mississippi Department of Archives and History. And with that, I will hand it over to Krista so she can get our discussion started.
Thank you, Rachel, and hello, everyone. Thanks for joining me today. The following presentation is adapted slightly from the presentation I gave at BPE 2023 in Athens, Georgia this past June, just to be upfront about that. I also want to preface this presentation by sharing that While it focuses on electronic records transfer, I am not focusing on transferring records that live natively in the cloud storage environment, such as Microsoft 365 or Google Drive. Instead, it focuses more primarily on transferring electronic records, often from one network storage environment to another. So those caveats out of the way, we can go to the next slide. So this presentation will cover the WHS context for transferring records, our early electronic records transfer procedure success and how it failed. Then I'll move on to an overview of the various approaches to electronic records transfers that we researched and wrap up with a brief look at our current method for handling transfers. Next slide. So our context, every year we acquire about 1,100 cubic feet of paper records. A representation of those are unprocessed boxes stacked in one of our storage areas is shown on the right side of the image of the slide. Electronic records make up a smaller portion each year. However, that number is growing and will continue to grow as transfer schedules catch up with the records creation in electronic environments. Our first electronic state records in the collection date back to the late 1970s. And from the late 1980s to the early 2000s, we passively collected electronic records, often in whatever external media they were stored on, the thought being that eventually we'd get around to dealing with them. In the early 2010s, we began to more seriously develop our electronic records program, and this took the form of Whisper, a set of NHPRC grants funded between 2015 and 2019, in which we collaborated with the state agencies to develop transfer procedures, set up our own workflows, opted into Preservica as our digital preservation system, and began processing and providing access to state records through the Wisconsin Electronic Records Portal. And since that time in 2017, we've been actively collecting, processing, and providing access to our electronic records. Next slide. Contributing to our efforts and almost a guiding principle is the state law, Wisconsin Administrative Code, Chapter Admin 12, with full text linked here on the slide. It lays out the requirements for electronic records management. The law also states that agencies must maintain electronic records that are accessible, accurate, authentic, reliable, legible, and readable throughout the record's life cycle. This law applies to state agencies as they create, retain, and disposition their records, and it applies to us at WHS as we receive and provide longer-term access to the electronic records. Next slide. So from the NHPRC grant and keeping in mind Chapter Admin 12, we developed a state agency transfer schedule and procedure, that you see on the slide. Agencies identify eligible records for transfer, complete the electronic records survey, and notify us at WHS. If it's the first time the agency transferred records, we set them up with Exactly and created a profile with an SFTP client. The agencies prepare the files for transfer and complete electronic records transfer agreements. Then they'll work with the tool Exactly to package and transfer records via SFTP to WHS, and we received and validated the records, confirming the transfer and notifying the agencies that they could delete their files on their end. And this procedure worked really well for us from about 2017 to 2022. Next slide. So Exactly is an application developed in 2015 by AVP. At the time of the grant, we chose Exactly because it was a free and open source application that facilitates the safe remote transfer of digital data. Exactly creates enhanced Baget packages, and it also enables users to create and fill out customizable metadata templates, performs Fixity checking for transfers, sends automatic email notifications after transfer, supported FTP and SFTP transfers, and integrates into file sharing workflows with cloud services like Dropbox or Google Drive. Next slide. Digging in a little deeper, Exactly creates transfer packages that enhance the basic Baget structure seen here in white text. This is the declaration, metadata, payload manifest, which lists the files with their checksums, a tag manifest, and payload directory. Exactly Bags included all those elements plus a few more. The first two are bag metadata files in CSV and XML formats, which is useful for integration with different accessioning and ingest tools that archives might use. It also includes file system data file, which records information about the sender's file system, including a directory listing of where the files were located, and that can be helpful in determining issues of provenance for some archives. Lastly, it includes a transfer report, which is a confirmation of the files, the sender, and the recipient. And this report is also included in email confirmation sent to both senders and recipients. And this tool and this process, like I said, were really useful to us from around 2017 to 2022. But then in next slide, we started to encounter some breakdowns in the process in about 2021. The first was that setting up and managing exactly an SFTP permissions was burdensome. Communication and coordination between all interested parties often became complicated. As the electronic records archivist, I was often stuck in the middle between state agencies who wanted to set up exactly the IT department at WHS, who had actual control and ability to set up permissions of the SFTP, but that was also managed by a separate network service provider. So there was another person there. We also had state agency IT departments who might be assisting with downloading exactly and having it set up, and AVP who might provide troubleshooting support with the tool itself if something was going wrong. So at any given time, there'd be conversation with any and all of these people in different streams, and it just became really complicated to communicate and get things set up and not efficient at all. Next slide. A second breakdown emerged as we started to think about collecting materials beyond state agencies. We wondered if exactly could scale to a variety of users. Top of mind were state agency records officers whose job duties might only list records management as 2% of their allowed time. How much IT support would county and municipal clerks receive? And how about individuals and organizations donating their papers to our manuscript collections? Exactly was useful for environments where people are familiar with networks and SFTPs and things like that, but what about these other areas? All the additional user personas we came up with, we assumed had a wide variety of skill and comfort level with the technology. And so could we easily explain, install, set up, run exactly in these environments? Could our IT manage the support needed for these additional users? And was all this effort worth it for scenarios that might only result in one-time transfers, especially with like those manuscript donors? Next slide. And then a third major breakdown was the loss of support and development for exactly by AVP in 2022. Quote, the reality is that exactly is now quite dated and in need of overhaul, requiring extensive resources. Continuing to offer support for the application in its current form is an exercise in using band-aids and bubblegum to hold things together, end quote. And that was from a user group message from the AVP CEO. This also coincided with AVP's shift as a company from developing software and assisting to a more purely consultant-based service. However, just in case, and you have the skill, you can still download exactly from AVP's GitHub account, but that support and use would be unsupported by AVP. So it's around, which is why I kind of flip-flop between was and is and present and past tense, because it's still out there, it's still open source, but it doesn't have much support. The next slide. So that left us in late 2022 trying to find out a new method for electronic records transfers. We began investigating alternative approaches and honestly are still kind of doing so even as I give this presentation and have a new scenario in mind. Pie in the sky, we'd identified that we would like an approach that is easy to explain and use, allows for remote contribution if at all possible, requires limited IP support or intervention, has methods or could support collecting metadata and or generating fixity information, and has the ability to handle large data transfers. So what will follow in the presentation are some of our findings and incomplete thoughts about the available options. Next slide. Of course, the standby option is to fall back on the use of external media. On the plus side, it's an established procedure, easy to explain, rarely needs IT support, and depending on the storage size of the medium, can handle large amounts of data. On the minus side, it's not a remote contribution method. There are possibly security issues from the potential presence of viruses to what's allowed connection at any given network by IT departments. And if we end up sending out drives and devices or even need to return items, it becomes a lot to manage and track. Of course, there's also the need for additional steps of metadata and fixity generation. Next slide. There's also the cloud-based tool options such as Dropbox, Microsoft 365, Google Drive, Dropbox, or any others that you can think of. Positively, these allow for remote contribution. They're understandable to a novice user. You can often set up links and landing pages for contributions, and it may not need any IT support. Potentially, you can also handle large data transfers. Negatively, you're trusting a third-party system. You still may need IT support to have access and permission to the tool. Upon the upload to the service, there might be a loss of critical metadata, and there still might be security issues for some IT departments depending on the service. Next slide. We could also investigate better ways to utilize SFTPs. The pro here is its remote contribution, relatively easy to set up, more acceptable to external IT departments, and it doesn't change metadata information and handles large amounts of data. On the cons, we would still be reliant on IT to manage this potentially, and it's still slightly more difficult to explain to a less technical user. Next slide. And of course, with the three options I just mentioned, external media, cloud-based tools, SFTPs, you're missing that Fixity information, file manifest, directory information that was so usefully contained in Exactly. Remember, Wisconsin code states we need to manage electronic records that are authentic and reliable, and all that information helps us prove that. Next slide. So maybe we could use one of those transfer tools, but pair it with other tools that can generate information that we need. There are individual tools such as exact file, which generate checksums, or the Windows command prompt, which create directory reports. Advantages, we get the information we want. Beyond installation and updates, there isn't much need for support from IT, and they handle large amounts of data. A disadvantage, of course, they're not transfer methods. They're harder to navigate for a novice user. They're potentially time-consuming to do these extra steps in multiple interfaces. Next slide. The National Archives and Records Administration, NARA, created File Lister in response to federal agency requests for support with preparing metadata and compliance with federal transfer requirements. So it allows users to pull the file name, file path size in bytes, file extension, date modified, and the SHA-256 hash in one file directory. This information is then exported to comma-separated values, .csv files, and it seems really useful as like a one and done type of tool. It is a Java tool in a jar file format, but it doesn't require installation or administrative privileges to use. But of course, you have to have Java to run it on your computer. And it's available at NARA's GitHub, also linked here. So as you might gather, on the positive, this is one tool that gathers metadata and Fixity. It's really straightforward to use and explain, doesn't require a lot of IT support, and seems to handle large amounts of data. A major negative for many places, and even us it seemed like for a little while, but maybe not as much as I thought, is that it runs in Java, which many state IT departments are leery about using in its form from Oracle. So using this tool would require investigating, promoting, and trying to get adoption from other open Java formats and providers, which may or may not be easy to do. Next slide. And then there's Baker by the Library of Congress, which again captures pertinent information, handles large data packages, and possibly has limited need for IT support. And you can find Baker on the Library of Congress's GitHub page. But also it's data packaging, not transfer. It is also written in Java, and it may be in a transition phase for support, so it may be at an end of life. It also takes a lot more effort to explain to a novice user of how to use this. Next slide. And then lastly, as Preservica users, we could try to leverage their features. On the plus side, there are a number of features which are available for us to use, including the remote contributor option, available to starter users and some professional users, or the use of OPEX and SFTP integration with secret keys. Or looking down the line, we could consider Preservica 365 and that feature. This also removes some of the need for agencies to prepare Fixity and digital preservation information before ingest, and reduces the number of participants in the workflow. What's holding us back is that we are hesitant to put all our eggs in one basket like we did it with Exactly. We're also in the middle tier, professional tier of Preservica users, and as such, implementing those features falls more on us rather than Preservica. And our electronic records transfers often contain messy data that requires some amount of processing before we feel it's ready to go into the preservation environment. Lastly, some of the tools won't work for our state's record management archives and archives environment. So there's advantages and disadvantages that we're considering as we look at Preservica. Next slide. So where we're at today, we've gathered information and feedback from our peers at BPE 2023. Thank you to anyone here who also provided information and feedback there. And we met with internal IT in July to discuss options, where I learned Java is maybe not as much of a hindrance as I thought before. Then we developed a new placeholder strategy, which we shared with state agency record officers in August. And so presently we are in a testing new procedures phase by accepting transfers from state agencies slowly but surely. So next slide. So the procedure we currently have has not changed much from what I showed you in the beginning of the presentation. Agencies still figure out what they have to transfer to us. They complete an electronic records survey. They still prepare their records for transfer, complete the transfer agreement, send the records to us, receive confirmation of their records have been received by us, and delete them from their storage location. So it hasn't changed drastically. What has changed, next slide, and it's not a big change, it's a minor change, but we made the electronic records survey electronic and applicable to both state and local units of government. It also acts more as our mechanism for collecting data, and we developed a similar survey for manuscript collections. So to get around not having a tool that's going to gather some of the metadata that we want, we're making the survey electronic so we don't have to deal with people dealing with PDFs and signing and not signing, and just click on a link, fill out some questions, I'll get the responses, and we can go from there. And then combined as well, the state government and local governments together in manuscripts in a different one, which very similar, but slightly different. Next slide. And now when it comes to the step 6, transfer of records, we've removed exactly from the equation and relying on talking with the agency transferring the records to identify the best and preferred transfer medium. So right now those mediums are an SFTP. Currently, if the agency has one, that's the method, because we're still in the middle of an IT transition and don't quite have one set up. So hopefully after this fall, we'll have our own to offer up as an option. But I can offer Dropbox, a file hosting service. Again, still might make some changes, but it's easy to explain to especially those manuscript donors or maybe smaller local governments, or external media, hard drives, CDs, DVDs, things like that. However, I'm in my own case of trying to get a hard drive back from an agency. So again, has its own problems as well. So again, it's not really that much of a change, but it's where we're at right now. And then last slide, I think, going forward, we hope to continue to gather more feedback and learn from our peers in opportunities like today. We will work through internal IT as we transition this fall, and then look to adopt the SFTP once that's better in place, and maybe even leverage some of those tools such as Preservica. So while continuing to develop, implement, iterate the procedures that we have in place, because we've learned we can't just let it sit and then scramble, which we should have known, but it always takes that reminder, right? So that's it for my very brief and I think kind of quick presentation, but I hope we all got something from it and can talk more about it with the rest of the session. And with that, I'll turn it back over to Rachel.
Yes, please don't go away, because now we're transitioning into our discussion time. And so, Becky, if you can stop the recording.